My baby dolls, we are back. Another episode of Genesis. As always, I am your host, Ian Kahanowitz. And today we're talking again, old-time baseball. And we're talking about somebody who you pretty much can, overlook in baseball history, and that's Ken Williams. And we got today the author of a great new book on his life story by Dave Heller. He's on the show, and we'll be talking about Ken Williams, the Slugger in Ruth Shadow. So you know he played in the late dead ball and well into the 20s. We'll be talking about who he is and what his contributions to baseball was. I know it's going to be an eye-opening show because I learned a lot from this book. And, it's published by McFarland. I think everyone should go out and get this book. It's not a long read. It's probably about 200 pages, 234, 235. Plus it has a nice index and appendixes, stats and records. The book was thoroughly researched. When reading Mr. Heller's introductions and preface, I know that he was pretty excited about internet research. And as most of you know, I'm doing a book on Ty Cobb and Tris Speaker and that whole Dutch Leonard affair that happened in 1926. And, I've been lucky just as Dave was to use the internet. We have something, a valuable resource where you don't have to travel across the country. And this book is well put together, and we'll get to Dave in about 2 minutes and the book. But you are listening to the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network with the Zigzag Man, our fearless leader, our producer, Ralph Tycho, and he has many new shows on, and one of them is Bill Cachetis with Philadelphia Baseball, Present, Past, and Future. We have Nancy Finley, the niece of Charlie O and those swinging A's, and she helps him with Oakland A's baseball. We also have Peter Golenbach, Golenbach's University, where the Menches all get together, Hal Bach, Peter Golenbach, and Ralph, and they discuss baseball, past, future, and what's going on right now in the pennant races. We also have Dave Nemec's old-time baseball and trivia with myself, Saber Guru, Alan Blumkin, and, of course, renowned author Dave Nemec. We also have Mark and Mark in the midday. We have Mark Littell, and again, if you don't know who Mark Littell was, he's the guy that served up the ball to Chris Chambliss in the 1976 American League Championship Series that sent the Yankees into the World Series against the Big Red Machine back in 1976. And he's on with my buddy Mark Weiss, and they have a great time doing shows. And Mark Littell is just so instrumental in bringing in good people to guest, people he played with, people who are in the mainstream baseball who write about it, reporters. So that's a show worthwhile to listen to. Now, Ken Williams, like I said before, you might not have heard about him. Now, Kenny Williams, when you look at his statistics and you actually read what he did and how he did it in the 1920s, let me just pose this for you, and then you'll understand why. For those of you who are statisticians, in a 14-year Major League career, Kenny Williams played in 1,397 games. He accumulated 1,552 hits in 4,862 at-bats for a .319 career batting average, along with 196 home runs, 913 runs batted in, and an on-base percentage of .393. He retired with a .958 fielding percentage. And now, as baseball evolved out of that ball era, this is the big thing. Williams finished in the top 4 in the American League in home runs in 7 consecutive seasons from 1921 to 1927. He posted 10 seasons with a batting average above 300 and 3 seasons in which he scored more than 100 runs. And as of 2016, Williams' .319 career batting average ranks 53rd in all-time Major League history. His .924 career on-base plus slugging percentage and his .530 career slugging percentage rank 45th, 48th respectively, all-time amongst Major League Baseball. Williams holds the St. Louis Browns / of course they moved to Baltimore in the 1950s, single-season record for runs batted in with 155 in 1922. He is the St. Louis Browns' all-time leader on base percentage with .403, slugging percentage .558, and OPS with .961. So why haven't we heard from him? Because we have Dave Hiller on the show today, who wrote about him, and you will know about him. And Dave has written and reported on sports for more than 20 years for many national newspapers, magazines, and websites. He has published 2 previous books on sports history, and he's up in Wisconsin, which, again, one place I have to visit, like I told him before the show. Without any further ado, welcome to the show, Dave. How are you?
Ian, thanks for having me. Doing great.
I hope I didn't butcher Kenny too much for you.
No, you did. You did a great job. Great self. Appreciate it.
Why Ken Williams? What's a guy in Wisconsin even thinking about Kenny Williams and things down in St. Louis?
Well, we have to go back many, many years to when I was very young. I actually grew up in Syracuse, New York, and you'd think I'm a Yankees fan or a Mets fan, but no, I actually grew up a Baltimore Orioles fan. And why, I could not tell you, but I have very early memories of being an Orioles fan. And I have a hat still to this day I had when I was like 4 years old as Orioles, the old Orioles hat with the all black and the cartoon bird. So for whatever reason, an Orioles fan, and as I grew older, I became a baseball history buff. And so naturally, Orioles, baseball history, right, St. Louis Browns, moved to Baltimore and became the Orioles. So there was a natural kind of thing going on there. And then the more I learned, the more, I was that guy in middle school and high school who was a baseball trivia buff and would be the kid in the cafeteria spouting off questions. And one of them was always who was the first 30-30 player. And this is before, this is the mid-'80s. So this is before the big 30-30 push happened in the stereo era kind of came around in 87. So 30-30s were kind of very rare, and no one really knew who Ken Williams was, and no one knew the answer. And so, of course, that was a go-to trivia question. And then as I got older and started into writing and researching, it's like, well, who is Ken Williams? What more do I know about him other than the fact he was the first 30-30 guy and also well-known, winning the HR title in 1922, as you mentioned, the 1 year Babe Ruth didn't win it. So it was just, it kind of, to me, it was natural curiosity. Who is this guy and what can I find out more about him? And here we are.
And let me ask you this question. I read those stats. Why has history forgotten about him?
I mean, it's a great question. I think he became, like I said, a trivia note. He played in an era with Babe Ruth, and as the book title suggests, he kind of got lost in that shadow. In St. Louis, it was George Sisler, kind of got lost in that shadow as well. The power boom kind of happened right after he retired, and, you had guys like Jimmy Fox and whoever else, Mellott, and whoever else you want to think of that 30s era when baseball kind of offense took off. So he kind of got lost in the shuffle, I think, and he played mainly in his when he was in the 30s, which is also rare for that era. So he didn't have a quote-unquote complete career per se, where he played, 20 years. So his stats aren't quite up to the snuff of some of the guys who played a little bit after him, and he just kind of got, like I said, got lost in the shuffle.
Do you think it had to, say he was on another team like the Yankees or
the
Cardinals? Would he have been in the Hall of Fame?
That's a great point. Playing for the St. Louis Browns, not exactly a franchise known for winning. Again, they moved to Baltimore, and they quickly became forgotten about as well. It didn't help his cause. I mean, if he had been traded to the Yankees before the 1927 season, which almost happened, would that have changed, perception of him? Perhaps. If the Browns were a winning team and one made the World Series, would that have changed the perception of him and the team? Again, I think it would have. The Hall of Fame discussion is a deeper discussion, but I kind of agree with you. At the time, if there was a Hall of Fame at the time, I think he would have been in there. Nowadays it's kind of hard when 300 home runs doesn't mean anything anymore. 196 certainly doesn't mean anything as well. So it's going to be very hard for him to make it. At one point I think he probably was deserving, but it's a tough sell nowadays.
Now let me just ask you this, because you start off the book great, and it's a question I had to ask. He's forgotten to history, but in St. Louis he was remembered. 30 years after he stopped playing, again, let's go through some of the great players at St. Louis. You had Dizzy, Daffy Dean, you had Frankie Frisch, you had Rogers Hornsby, you had Sislo, like you mentioned, you had Hall of Famer Jesse Haynes, and at the time, you had Stan Musial and Red Shondas. And there was a banquet or something, and the biggest applause were for Kenny. Let's describe what he was feeling at the time when they had that dinner.
Yeah, I think it was a shock. I mean, it was totally unexpected. I think he thought people forgot about him because you're talking 1957, 58. He last played in St. Louis in 1927. He retired after MLB the majors. Last year was 29. So it had been quite a while since he had played. The Browns were no longer in St. Louis at that point. He never really traveled much, especially back to St. Louis. So I think he thought he was forgotten, and it was a really touching moment. And he barely could speak. He was so taken aback by the applause that he got. It was more than anyone else. It was reported more than anyone else, as he said, more than usual got, which is, he was in his prime back then, more than anyone else got. And it showed that he wasn't forgotten back in 1957, 58. Unfortunately, that was also 50, 60 years ago, so time has passed on as well. And he's become more forgotten as the days have gone on.
Let me ask you this question, because it's a very interesting place where he was born, in Grants Pass, Oregon. Mm-hmm. Again, when he was growing up in the early 1900s, there was something called the Pacific Coast League. Why didn't they notice him?
Yeah, it's a good question. He played briefly for a team in the Pacific Coast League in 1912. You're making me think about my memory here. Just as kind of a fill-in player. And he had been scouted a little bit by the Portland Beavers, who obviously were very nearby. There were two Portland teams back then. One was Pacific Coast League, and they had another one, another league, lower level league. And but he was playing in amateur ball, semi-pro ball, and I guess they just didn't. It's a big jump from semi-pro ball to what was probably considered more of a Double-A team now. And Triple-A now is probably more of a Double-A level back then. That's a huge jump to make, to go from amateur to that high up. So, but maybe word, trickled down somewhere, because he eventually got a job in the minors, but it took him a while to get to the PCL.
Well, let me ask you this question. How the heck did he end up in Western Canada for playing for the Regina Red Sox?
That's a good question, and I don't know if I have a specific answer to that, but I think there was a job, right? That was a pro job. That's why he took it. He was playing in a semi-pro league in California, and the guy who was running the Regina team lived in Oregon, and likely did a lot of scouting in that area. A lot of the players they signed were from the Oregon area. Either saw Ken, heard of Ken, whatever. He was a very well-known player in that semi-pro circuit. He was very well thought of. So somehow, some way, the manager got Billy Hewlin was his name, got a whiff of Ken, and he was one of the guys that was signed. And like I said, there were a number of Oregon players that were signed. So it had to be something in that area where he saw or knew players. And, going from semi-pro ball, we were making a few bucks, playing this on the weekends, to a real-time baseball job, even though it was the lowest level of minor league baseball possible. It sounds, that's definitely an upgrade. So why not go to Canada?
My question is also this. Now, look, I followed hockey for 40 years now. I mean, Edmonton is the most northern place we have. And I know a few people who came from the city in Alberta. Again, Calgary is much well below it. But in Edmonton, they ride with chains on their tires from September right through May. How the heck did they get on the Edmonton Eskimos?
Yeah, Edmonton, so he played in Regina in 1913 and started there in 1914. And for whatever reason, it must have been, they had a new manager in 1914, Charlie Stiff. And for whatever reason, they did not get along. I don't know what the situation was, because Ken was having a pretty good season and had a cut down date that expanded rosters early in the season. Things that cut down to a certain number by May 15th. And out of nowhere, they cut Ken. And he was one of the leading hitters in the team and was technically a free agent at that point. Edmonton needed an outfielder. They had a bunch of injuries, and they came calling, so they picked up Ken, and he had a fantastic season and kind of went from there. That was his last year in the Canadian League, Western Canada League, was 1914, for various reasons. But Yeah, that's how he got to Edmonton. They knew him. They had played against him. They were in the same league. They needed an outfielder, and he was a good hitter on the market.
Now, let's step back a little bit because it's interesting because after that, he went back across the border and played up in Washington with the Spokane Indians in 1915. And I think that's where they got noticed by the Reds. And we'll talk about that in about a second. But let's start with the origins of Kenny. When he was born in 1890, the first thing I'm going to ask you was there was a discrepancy with his age. What's that story about?
Well, he was born in 1890. That's for sure. The discrepancy you're saying is obviously when he started playing, he said he was born later than 1890, and that was never stated why he said that, but it was pretty obvious why he did that. Would you rather be 25 years old trying to make a major league or 22 years old making the major leagues? And 22 years old would obviously be much more appetizing for major league teams to take a look at you. So a number of players in baseball history have done this to kind of fake their age, and Ken went along with it. And apparently somebody either told him to do this or he thought of it on his own. But it went through his whole career. No one really knew his exact age when he was playing. In fact, when he died, the Sporting News had his wrong age in their obit. So it was a little white lie, I guess he told to make sure he got a look when the time came, and it worked out. So I guess we can't blame him.
Now, you even put his birth certificate in. Let me ask you this: to construct this book, through the research, and I know you've used hundreds of newspapers and stuff on it. How long did it take you to research and write the book?
Boy, that's a good question. I kind of took a time out in between to write another book, so it's kind of hard to say, but it was probably 5 years total. Taking a couple years out to do something else. So I did go to Oregon at one point to do some research. I could not get those papers online or in a library sent to me here in Wisconsin. So I actually flew out to Oregon, went to the University of Oregon for like 3 days, and just spent the entire time at the University of Oregon library and rifled through newspapers out there. But it was about 5 years, especially using microfilm a lot. Talking a few years back, it was harder to get. Like online now, you can get almost anything ASAP. But I had to get a lot of stuff sent to me and go to the library. So that was a couple-week process to order the microfilm, get it, look at it, send it back. Keep doing that over and over again for a couple of years. So about 5 years total. Take out a year or two for doing another book. Because
you did devote a chapter to him growing up. And, again, he grew up in the Pacific Northwest. We got logging. How was it as a child for Kenny growing up in that area of the country?
Yeah, not too much known about him other than, he did go to school, not fully. One report about third grade, but his son thought it was more eighth grade, and that makes more sense looking at some of the stuff I found. So school was not of the utmost importance to him. His brothers, he had a number of brothers who all worked mentioned the logging industry. We talked about that off the air. A couple brothers worked in the logging industry, which was huge in Oregon at the time. Another brother was a salesman and went away. His dad was kind of a jack of all trades kind of guy. He, at one point, tried to mine gold, and at another point, he was real estate and he was a teacher. So I think Ken just kind of did odd jobs around and went to school for a little bit and played baseball. And that was obviously probably number one on the list.
Now, you came from a family of what, 4 or 5 siblings?
Right.
And
all brothers.
All brothers, yeah, that's right. And none of them had a desire to play baseball?
None of the rest of them. I could not find any instances of any of the brothers playing baseball or any other sports. Ken, I did find, played football a little bit for Grants Pass, but he was the only one I could find, and he was the youngest. So that's sometimes, when you're the youngest child, sometimes your parents are worn down, and the brothers are all working, so the younger one can kind of slip by and do what he wants. So, he was the one that got out and had the most fun, I guess.
Now, this is odd. He worked in a box factory, right? Because he left school around the 8th grade. How the heck did he find time? Well, first of all, why did you find that interested him first in baseball?
I'm sorry, when did he find interest in baseball? Ken?
Yeah, well, he's working in a box factory. Again, child labor laws were pretty much relaxed in those years. His first coming under Roosevelt, the first Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt. But, he worked in a box factory, probably about 10 to 12 hours a day. How the heck did he find time to play baseball, and where did he find his love for baseball?
Well, the box factory, I think, a little wink, wink. He worked there when he played baseball for semi-pro teams. The box factories would often sponsor teams. And I'm not exactly sure what he did in the box factory to get him to play baseball. It might have been just like a security job, standing around, working so he could play. And he did that in a couple of places in California as well. He'd go there, and his sons didn't think he actually did any real work in those factories. They're not totally positive, but it makes sense because they just wanted, the ball players. And the love of baseball, it's a good question. The Grants Pass did found some teams very early on in the late 1800s and early 1900s. So there's a lot of baseball going around there at Oregon, despite at the time not being very well populated. They had a number of baseball teams and baseball leagues were sprouting up. And then one of the players in Oregon named Judd Purnall went to the major leagues at some point. That had to have, been kind of an occasion where you see that baseball could lead you somewhere. He went to the minors first and with Portland and made it to the majors. And hey, baseball can be a life. So I think that was definitely help to Ken to see that he didn't have to work per se. He could play baseball.
Well, let me ask you this question. This is odd. He was a natural right-hander.
Right.
How the heck did he end up batting on the left side?
These are great questions, and I wish I had specific answers to them. One problem with Ken was he didn't tell his sons much, and his sons didn't ask questions much, and the family really looked forward and looked behind. So they kind of regret that now, obviously, wishing they had learned more about their dad. There's no instance of anywhere I've seen where Ken mentioned why he bats lefty. But he did bat lefty his entire career, starting, in semi-pro ball and amateur ball on Grants Pass, and through right-handed. Golfed very little, but he would golf left-handed as well. So maybe it was just a natural thing to him. I don't know, but I think he made the right choice because he was a pretty darn good hitter.
Wow, and now he ends up on the Portland Beavers over here because they were referred to as Casey's Colts. Now, when you think about it, you would think it's Casey Stengel, but we all know Casey was in the Major League Baseball. What's going on here?
Yeah, that was up there. Another manager. His name was Casey. Yeah, and it's a Portland, again, very big baseball town. They would come through, via train going to spring training or somewhere else. They'd stop off and make a few bucks and play these are the local teams. And Ken actually had a very good game against them a couple times. So he was a known commodity. Ended up there eventually playing with Portland later in his career after he made a name for himself in Spokane. And he was then became a viable commodity. And Portland, looking for a hard-hitting outfielder, bought him from Spokane, and a couple of years later, he was in St. Louis.
Yeah, the thing is, he played. This is interesting. Tell me about what happened in 1912 when the Oakland Oaks came to visit.
All right. So this is something I found out that I had not seen anywhere else. Look at Baseball Reference or any other statistical site, or even Ken's Hall of Fame file. There's no mention of him playing in the minors in 1912. However, the Oakland Oaks came to, or was it Oakland? Was it Sacramento? Now you're getting me confused on the book in front of me, and my memory is going. But they played in Portland in 1912 and needed an outfielder, and they had a couple of injuries and a couple of guys weren't playing well, and one of Ken's former teammates named Al Baker had happened to be playing on that team, and again making a presumption that he would have tipped off, hey, you need an outfielder. There's a guy in Grants Pass who's pretty good. Why don't you get him? And Ken had thought at the time, he thought that the Red Sox, who had a loose affiliation, there was no actual affiliations between major and minor league teams back then, had signed him to go play for Sacramento in Portland, which is very close to Grants Pass. So he went up there and played a few games, went 3 for 8, figured he was going to, be part of the team next year. They told him to kind of sit tight, and turned turns out that they didn't really need him after that. They signed someone else, and Ken did not appreciate that and actually sued for back pay, which might not have been the wisest decision to make in the era of reserve clauses and guys getting pretty easily blackballed if organized baseball wanted that. And he did lose his case, did not get his back pay, but all was forgotten about. Eventually, he made it back to the organized baseball, but that was probably not the wisest move on his part, maybe a little hubris, but he did his pro career actually did start in 1912, as you mentioned, even though the records don't show it. He did play in a few games in Portland.
Let me ask you this. Walter McCready has to be the one person that I think Williams can hang his hat on that got the kid noticed.
Mm-hmm.
I think he was instrumental in helping Williams at least be noticed by the Cincinnati Reds. Why do you think McCready had such an interest in him?
I don't know. I mean, McCready, again, long-time Portland baseball magnate, was aware of him for a long time, I think. Like I said before, how Portland would come through town and play these little teams, and he knew of Williams because Williams had some games against Portland. One year, he actually, before he went to Regina, Williams hit a home run off Carl Mays, who would later play in the major leagues and be a teammate of Williams in the minors. But at the time, the fences, the crowd was there, and within the crowd, they made a determination that any ball hit that far would be a double. So actually, he lost a home run that would have tied the game, and Portland or Grants Path ended up losing. Anyways, the point is, the kid stood out, and he always stood out. This is 1913, so he played for Portland in 1916, 1917. So I think McCready just always knew of him, and there wasn't many guys like Ken. He could really do everything. He was a five-tool player, and he hit for power, he hit for average, he was really fast, he had a great arm, and decent fielder. Had a few issues with ground balls, but really could do everything. And that's the kind of guy who's going to stand out to a baseball lifer like McCready.
Let me just say this. Again, we're talking about the dead ball era. So power wasn't an issue yet because the ball that was used was one or two balls. By the time 9 innings rolled around, you know what that ball looked like? It looked like a head of cabbage with leaves falling off of it. With spit on, again, spitballs were allowed. Tobacco. I think Burley Grimes put elm wood juice on it to juice the balls. That wasn't why he was noticed in reading. He was noticed for his speed, even at 6 feet tall.
Yeah, he could steal base. He was fast. He wasn't necessarily the smartest base runner. He was very aggressive in the base paths, but he was very fast. And I mean, you do mention the power. I mean, he was known for his home runs. I found instances of him being called Home Run Williams as far back as 1913. There are a lot of instances of him. I don't have the exact number where the papers, of course, would embellish, but nevertheless, there are a lot of longest home runs ever hit in this ballpark or in this field. A lot of times, it was spring training or minor leagues. A lot of mentions of that from Ken. This is even before he made the major leagues. And he, led Portland in home runs in 1917, hit 3 in a game for Portland, which is a very rare occurrence. When he was in the minors in Spokane, he hit the double fence there, and no one ever hit one over there before. And he hit 2 over there in one season. So he had power in an era where, as you mentioned, power was not something that was very usual. I mean, there was triple power. Guys could hit the ball far, and the ballparks were also very big. But he had power, and he was known for it. But as you say, he could steal base. He stole over 60 bases in Portland one year, so he could run.
And that's a big thing, because we'll get to the transition from dead ball and live ball, and I always ask a certain question. I'll get to that in about 3 minutes. But so he went to Cincinnati, and let me ask you this question. What was his relationship with Charlie Herzog? Because Herzog didn't like what he saw. But what was his relationship with Williams at the outset when he was drafted by Cincinnati?
Yeah, so he was in Spokane and was drafted, as you mentioned, or signed by Cincinnati. And at the time, supposedly, Cincinnati really wanted Jack Smith, another left-handed outfielder who actually played with Williams in Regina for a little bit. but Smith is also left-handed and ended up signing with St. Louis because Cincinnati wanted a player now. They wanted a player to finish the season out. They thought they could. They were like in 7th place, but they thought it was a very tight pennant race. Thought they could win the pennant still. They had a chance. They wanted someone now. That Smith, they wanted to wait till the season was over. His team. So, long story short, they got Williams. Herzog did not make that signing. Herzog was out scouting somewhere else. So I'm not sure how much Buck Herzog wanted Williams on his team. He got him. He did play him once he got there. But Herzog did not like Williams' batting style. Williams, was more of a, like I said, he was still a power guy in the dead ball year. He could hit the ball really far. He hit to all fields at that point. But Herzog wanted him to change his batting style and the choke up style. Don't hit for as much power, more place hitting. That was not Williams' game. And I don't think Herzog was ever 100% in on Ken Williams. And later on, he actually, he got other outfielders, brought in Creasy Neal, and Creasy Neal eventually took his job, and Ken made a few flubs in the outfield the next year, 1916. I don't think many of the players liked Buck Herzog either, because he was a player manager and thought himself more not as a player, and really didn't hang out with the guys. He'd stay in different hotels and do different things. So wasn't a popular guy, and I don't think he and Ken really ever clicked.
Now, this is interesting. When they cut him so they can do the 21 player limit on May 1st, I know he returned to Spokane, but the 1916 season, he spent the time between Spokane and Portland, and he was with Portland again the following year, and this is where he broke out. Let's describe what's going on in 1917 with Williams here.
Yeah, you're right. 1917 was it was a breakout year. That was it. He led the league in home runs. I think only one other player in all minor league baseball had more home runs than he did that year. Stole a number of bases. Hit 313. He was the guy. They played more games back then. He played over 190 games. That was just the PCL back then. They played a lot of games. Played until late October. And he got a lot of interest quickly from major league teams. The way he was playing, it was just. I think everyone knew at that point he was a major league baseball player. Why he did succeed in Cincinnati did not stop him from succeeding still and getting back to his game. And he's mentioned McCready kind of let him get back to his game, and there was a number of scouts came in to sign him beyond the Browns, the Giants, the Tigers, the Pirates. A number of teams really were interested in Ken. There weren't many players like him. The all-around game that he had was very rare.
Now, what's interesting is this is eye-opening because again, dead ball era. He had 24 home runs, and against Vernon on June 3rd, Williams hit 3 home runs and added a double on that day. Now, the Browns come in. Great guy, Bob Quinn. Let's talk about Bob Quinn, why he was a good shroud of talent, and how he got his hands on Williams.
Yeah, so he was the business manager back then for the Browns, or what we'd probably call a general manager these days. And he was one of the number of teams that was scouting Ken. And as I mentioned earlier, back then there wasn't really like we have now with the farm team. Teams have all these farm teams. But back then there was a loose affiliation. Teams would kind of connect themselves with one minor league team and kind of make a lot of player transactions. And St. Louis had that at one point. Cleveland had it at one point with Portland. But there was a falling out between the two franchises. And kind of St. Louis stepped in and started making some transactions. And it turned out Babe Borton was one of the guys that Portland had bought from St. Louis, but owed them some money on him still. So they kind of used Ken as collateral when they wanted to finish that deal off. And Bob Quinn knew the guy he wanted was Ken. They definitely had an opening in the outfield. St. Louis is not a very good team. Needed any help they could get. And the transaction was made much to the chagrin of the manager of Portland, who was Walter McCready's son, or nephew, excuse me, and didn't think he got the best deal for Ken, but it really turned out that Portland owed the Browns money, and that made the most sense to make a deal with them and kind of get that debt off the books. And Bob Quinn made a really smart deal to make that transaction.
Now, of course, we're talking 1917 to 1918. Here comes World War I. He was called to duty, Williams. What branch of the military did he serve?
So he was in the Army. He got sent to he was drafted. First, let's put it that way. He was drafted. After a little bit of rigmarole, he was going to get drafted in Oregon. Kind of got displaced to Missouri, where he was with the Browns, obviously, and got the notice that he was going to be called. There was no they weren't sure when he was going to be called, but he was going to be called. And so Fielder Jones, who was the manager of the Browns, decided he wasn't going to play Ken because why play a guy I'm going to be missing out on anyways? Why get myself all excited if he does well and then I'm going to lose him? So he didn't really play Ken. And finally, a few weeks later, Ken did get called to Jefferson Barracks, which is in Missouri, and he spent many months there. Probably more than he should have. That was more like a way, I guess they call it a way station. Kind of come in and go out to your unit. But he was there from May until October, November, which was well beyond the usual amount, mainly because he played baseball and they had baseball teams there. And he finally was going to get shipped out to Europe, but then the war ended. And as his son said, he was on a boat, and they turned the boat around and came home. So he never saw any action.
He was lucky. Now, let me just say
He was lucky.
So he goes home. He marries Edith Willerens in 1919, the year of the Peace Conference, of course, and they had two sons, Kenneth Jr. and Jack. Now, this is important because he's trying to get into the lineup, Williams. And in 1920, a lot of people don't know this. I mean, yes, the Cleveland Indians finished first. It was a very devastating year when Ray Chapman was hit in the head by Carl Mays and died. Tris Beaker was the manager of the Indians. But look at the St. Louis Brown team. I mean, you had George Sisler at first. You had Williams in the outfit. You had Baby Doll Jacobson in center. You had Jack Tobin in right. They were superior batsmen. And you had Hank Severett was a great catcher. And to top it off, you had a pristine pitcher in Urban Shaka. What's going on in the 1920 season?
Well, that's Joe Gedeon, who was considered one of the best hit and run players at the time at second base. Wally Gerber was a solid shortstop. The problem is, you mentioned Urban Shocker. That was about it. They didn't have a lot of pitching. Dixie Davis was solid, but very inconsistent. And other than that, they really, and this has kind of plagued the Browns throughout the 20s, they just did not have enough pitching. And they could hit the ball, and they had some great players who were there for many years who hit the ball. You mentioned most of them there with Williams, Sisler, Tobin, and Jacobson. But if you can't pitch and you can't play defense, you're not going to win. And that was their problem. And they also came a lot of great teams. The Indians were a fantastic team. The White Sox were very good that year as well. And then the Yankees kind of came around, obviously with Babe Ruth in the upcoming years. So it was a very thin margin of error. And if you don't have the pitching staff to compete, you're not going to win. They came close one year, but in 1920 they weren't quite there yet.
And Williams had a good start that year. He batted .307 with 10 home runs and 72 ribbies. I think Ruth in his first year with the Yankees hit 59 home runs. I mean, it literally began the power age right there. Right.
Yeah. And Williams at that time, he was 30 years old in 1920. So his career basically began when he was 30. He played very briefly in 1919 because he was hit by a Walter Johnson pitch and missed most of the season, among other injuries. And so his career basically started when he was 30, which is another incredible thing, I think, about him, as how successful he was at that late age in that era. But he had power. He said 34 doubles, 13 triples, 10 home runs. At that point, he was hitting the all field still. He wasn't. St. Louis had a kind of a shorter right field, and at that point, he had not yet altered his swing to take advantage of St. Louis. That would happen the next couple of years, thanks to Ruth. Obviously, that was that was the motivation for his turning into really one of the preeminent sluggers of the era.
But let me ask you this question, and I ask everybody who writes about the dead ball transition to the live ball. Did you in your research come across anything to signal why you're going from a few home runs in the dead ball era to now the ball just leaving the puck? Was there anything different in the balls? Was there anything different about choking up on the bat? Maybe choking down on the bat? Did you come across any of that?
Well, there's a few things. First, I guess, would be the abolition of the spitball. Obviously, I think everyone talks about that. The fewer trick pitches. That ball is hard to hit. That ball would really break, and a lot of pitchers threw it. And they would put, as you mentioned earlier, a number of things in that ball to make it do tricks. So the abolition of the spitball, obviously a few players were grandfathered in, but only 2 per team, so there wasn't that many. That's one. 2, you mentioned Ray Chapman obviously getting hit and being killed. There was then a movement to not throw out balls, or to bring in balls that were not so dirty and can be seen. Cleaner balls, more white balls, easy to hit. And then there was talk that ball was juiced. Now there was talk that it wasn't. Like Rogers Hornsby came out and said this ball is not juiced. He would bounce them and they would be the same. And Reach baseballs come out and said we're making the exact same way. So I don't know. Maybe the truth is somewhere in between there with the baseballs. I don't know. And then you mentioned, of course, Babe Ruth, and everyone sees Babe Ruth swinging from his heels, which no one ever did. And that changed a lot of not many, because a lot of old school guys still around, and these players have been around for years, and the managers obviously were all players or managers who played in an era when there wasn't guys swinging from the heels. So it took a while to catch on. I think that's why later in the 1920s and 30s, power really took off. But batting styles changed as well, eventually.
Because Cobb and Speaker both said, look, there's no difference in the ball. It's just the way
right.
that, we stand. We now hold it near the butt of the bat. We don't choke up. We're not just trying to slap at the ball and run. The whole persona, the whole dynamics of what baseball used to be, which was, if you've gone back and listened to Lawrence Riz, the glory of their times, they all said, whoever they interviewed, I listened to Smokey Joe, I listened to Chief Bender, I listened to a lot of these guys who said baseball was different in those games. You had to think more. It just wasn't getting up there and knocking it out of the park because you couldn't. You couldn't even see the ball by the time the 7th inning rolled around and darkness was coming because they all played in the afternoon.
Right.
It was a game of stealing. And, of course, Kenny had the speed. It was a game of, like you mentioned, hitting to all corners of the ball field. It wasn't honing in and trying to use your strength to leave the park. And the whole dynamics of baseball changed in 1920. Now, also what changed in 1920 was the National Commission because you had the whole Black Sox scandal. So now you no longer have the National Commission with Van Johnson, National League president, and an independent, overseer. You now have Landis, Commissioner Kennesaw Mountain Landis. And after 1920, again, these guys aren't making a hell of a lot of money. Bob Musial, Babe Ruth took part in a barnstorming tour. They wanted to earn some extra money in the off season. Now Landis comes back, finds him, sits for 6 weeks. Now what was going on with Kenny Williams?
Yeah, so Ken took advantage, right? At that point, in 1921, Ken was convinced early in the season to not only change his swing, but change his style of hitting. Instead of being a hitter to all fields, St. Louis had a shorter right field fence. When I say shorter, it was still like 320, 330, but compared to 400 and something from other stadiums. And they said, look, Ruth plays in the Polo Grounds, which has a very short right field. It was even shorter. It was like 290. And he hits he's left-handed. He hits in the right field. You should do the same. You had the same success here in St. Louis. Williams took it to heart, did it, hit 24 home runs in 1921. So he really had took advantage of his ballpark at that point. 1922, as you mentioned, those players were warned, don't barnstorm. They did anyways, and Landis laid the hammer down on them. With no Ruth, Williams captured the attention of everyone because in April he had a fantastic April. He was the first player to hit home run in 6 straight games. He homered twice in the same inning. First player to do that as well. So he got this fantastic home run start. People started comparing him to Ruth the previous year because Ruth had hit 59, as you mentioned, 59 home runs in 1921. And Ruth had X amount of home runs after April. Here's where Williams stands. And then, as it turned out, Ruth's first game back was in New York against St. Louis. So there was a lot of hype, and it just kind of went the whole way. And Ruth was quoted about Williams and talked about him, and the two were compared the entire season.
And what's interesting is, again, Ruth had 6 weeks off. Ruth hit 35 home runs.
Yeah, right.
39. So, again, we know Ruth would have won the home run title. But here's a statistic that I'm not so sure of. Williams drove in 155, and Babe only did 99. Now, with an extra 6 weeks of playing, I don't think he'd be able to pass Williams with 155 ribbies. You have 56 ribbies away. What do you think about that?
No, I agree with you. I mean, Williams had the advantage, too, of having someone named George Sisler batting in front of him, and George Sisler was on base a lot. So he had the advantage of knocking in a guy who managed to get on base in front of him, and Ken took advantage of every opportunity and knocked in a ton of runs. As you mentioned, 155 and 153 games. So I don't think Ruth would have passed him. Would he have passed him home runs? I think Ruth would have hit at least 5 more home runs, I'm sure. But there was only one Babe Ruth, that's for sure.
Now, this is where Kenny gets national news, because now comparisons across the United States, not only in St. Louis, they're starting to compare him to Ruth, but
right.
Yet he remains humble. What's going on with Williams? What's he thinking now?
Yeah, I mean, he was kind of humble. I think he knew Ruth was. Everyone knew who Ruth was. Ruth was the preeminent hitter in the game, and no one was going to be like Ruth. He just wanted to be the best he could be, and he wanted to lead the league in home runs. That's not being mistaken. He wanted to do that, and he even talked about breaking Ruth's record at some point. He thought it was folly, but he would love to do it. And he really wanted to hit 40, and he came one shy of it. But he always tipped his hat to Ruth. Never really gotten that war of words or anything like that. Like Ruth made a bet that he'd pass Williams in home runs, or he'd be the first to 30 home runs regardless. And but Williams never fell in that trap. He wasn't that kind of guy. He was not maybe media savvy as Ruth was. He was just a kid from Oregon who wanted to play baseball, and that's pretty much who he was.
Let me ask you this question. Now, when did Williams start using a 48-ounce bat? Excuse me, a 48-ounce bat.
Right. That was I've seen that many times that he used that in like 1920, 21, 22, 23, 24. But I think he'd vary his bat size as well. But he definitely used a heavier bat all throughout the 1920s. That was the thing to do. I mean, Ruth used a big bat. Hornsby used a heavy bat. But that was thought to provide you with more power. Having a heavy bat would provide you with more power. And nowadays, obviously, guys with that thin handle and thicker bats for bat speed. But back then, I thought heavy bat, ball goes further.
Let me ask you this. Although, again, the 22 Browns, they compiled a good record, 93 and 61, and they finished behind the Yankees a game and a half, and I know the Yankees went on to play McGraw and the Giants and lost again in 22. Besides the 44 team, by which the Browns did win, and again, most of the players were gone in World War II. Some historians say that this St. Louis Browns team was the best they ever fielded. Do you agree with that?
Well, you've come to the right place, Ian, because I also wrote a book on 1944 Browns. So I've researched both these teams pretty extensively. And I would tell you that, yes, I mean, I think the 22 Browns were much more talented. Probably should have won the pennant that year in 22. Sisler got hurt late in the year. It didn't help. The pitching, again, was not quite up to snuff. But that team was clearly the best team in St. Louis Browns history. There's no doubt in my mind, despite not making the World Series.
You're going to have to send me the 44 Browns and we'll get you back on the show. I love talking about this with you, man. This is great. This is good stuff. Now, 23, Sisler was sidelined. He was diagnosed with sinusitis, and his optic nerves became infective. But again, it caused concern in St. Louis because without Sisler, the others would have to be pulling more of a weight, and they wouldn't be able to win. How did this affect morale of the 1923 Browns?
Yeah, it was a strange thing. Really reading back, looking nowadays, you read about Sisler, always out for the season, and everyone, okay, fine. But back then, reading about it, they never knew when he was done for the year. In spring training, it was, he'll be back in a week. They really weren't sure what it was. I'll be back in a couple of weeks. I'll be back end of April, end of May, June. And the Browns didn't really go for a first baseman, to fill the slot, not knowing if they had known in spring training he was out for the season, they would have made overtures to get a first baseman. Never did. And I think, the players, when they talk, and they talk a lot in hotels and spring training, there was concern. If he didn't come back, their team was in trouble. Even Williams said that without Sisler, we're kind of, we're doomed, to paraphrase him, because he was such a key player. I mean, as I said, Williams drove into 155 the year before. A lot of the reason was Sisler batted 420 hitting in front of him. So without that bat, how do you replace a bat like that? And they did a very poor job of replacing him. I think that the morale definitely took a hit. The team, Kenny had a great season. He had one of perhaps his best seasons if you really look at statistically, looking at his his slugging and OPS and batting average. But he drove a 91, and he was batting in the same spot in the order pretty much the whole season. So that he wasn't 22. So, losing a guy like that and not knowing he was out for the year, and then really bringing a guy in who was probably not a major leaguer, Dutch Schleifner, he's a fine fielder, but he couldn't hit. It was a big loss. And how do you replace a guy like that? And I think it just, as you say, morale, I think it just, when you don't know, and then suddenly it's done, I think the morale just took a hit all year because they never knew, and once they knew, they were already one foot out the door.
And in 23, if you thought 22 was the standout of his season, yes, he dropped in home runs by 10. He drove in 29, and he did drive in 64 less runs. But he had a career-high batting average of 357. He hit 37 doubles and had almost 200 hits with 198.
Yeah, and he missed a few games here and there, but he had to play every day. He was, like I said, he was a great player, and I'm, some part of me is sad that people don't know more about him, and he has been forgotten and maybe not considered a great player, but he was a great player. I mean, his OPS plus, people who like advanced stats, that was his best OPS plus. It was 171 a year, so he was that much better than 100 being an average baseball player that year. He was 171. He was that much better than everyone else that was playing in the major leagues that year. He was fantastic.
Now, here's something. Tell me about the events that happened on August 14th, 1925.
Yeah, that was an unfortunate day for Ken. He was having perhaps going on pace for his best season ever. He probably would have led the league in home runs. He had 25 at that point, and that really could have changed his career. Thinking about it, his perception if he had been a two-time home run leader instead of a one-time. But they're playing Cleveland. He took a pitch to the skull during the game, and that was it for him for 1925. He could barely walk to first base. He had a concussion that lasted for months. I mean, he had the buzzing in his ear. He had to put him in a hospital, and no one could, in complete quiet for weeks. And if you can imagine that, lights off and no one saying a word for you for weeks. I can't imagine. But the buzzing continued through him throughout the fall in his head. So this was a very serious blow he took to the head on a pitch from Cy Spieth in Cleveland. And they said at the end of the season, at the time, like I say, at 25, he was leading the league in home runs. He probably would have led the league. Bob Usual, it was a long competition that year because Ruth had his issue with his so-called tummy ache. It's just too bad that happened to him. And expected the next year, still a good year, but he was never quite the same player. He wasn't as bad as everyone thinks he was after that, but that definitely kind of rocked the foundation.
Now, Bob Quinn, the general manager over here, and some partners decided to look east. They bought the Boston Red Sox because, again, the Red Sox were faltering after the dead ball era, something that would happen well into the 30s and into mid-40s. And, of course, they would have their hardships against the Yankees when they did have good teams in the 40s and 50s. Why did Quinn want to obtain Williams for Boston when he knew that Williams endured this injury, and although he wasn't the same player, he still thought he had something left in the tank. And now, Bob's what, 35, 36 years old?
Yeah, well, once he was actually 38. They thought he was 35. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, so now he's 38 years old, Kenny. So, why get Williams? Would he be a crowd inducer to get people into the ballpark?
Right, it's a good question. I mean, why would Boston want Boston was a very bad team, as you mentioned. And why would they want to, even if he was 35 years old, why would they want a 35-year-old outfielder? He actually, at 26, after the year he got hit, he had a decent year. It wasn't great. He was used spotty when he played. He actually played pretty well. He still slugged .510. It wasn't like his career came to an end. And then the next year in 2070, he rebounded, had a really good year when they played him. He hit .322, slugged .525. Had a good on-base percentage. So he had a good year. He was 17 home runs each of the previous 2 years. So it's not like his career went into a tailspin after being hit. He came back as a good player. And Quinn obviously knew Williams, was very familiar with Williams. Now, part of the problem with Bob Quinn owning the Red Sox was they put all their capital into buying the Red Sox, and they had very little capital for anything else. So they needed players. And Williams, I guess, was a known name. They thought he could help. He wasn't that expensive, the contract. It's hard to say why they wanted him. I think, there are other teams interested in him, and Ken's career probably would have been better to go somewhere else. He did get after him to play a lot in Boston the first year, but it wasn't a match made in heaven. I mean, it was fine. They're still a bad team, and one player isn't going to make a team from 60 wins to 90 wins, and that's what happened. They still were not a very good team, and Ken's career kind of ended right there. As I mentioned, he was kind of at the end of the line as it was, being 38, even if they thought he was 35. If he was 38, maybe they wouldn't have brought him aboard, but Quinn did, and he's still at 300. So
I sense a pattern here. 1919, he gets married. Look at the 9 in the end. 1922, he has 39 home runs. Next year, he has 29 home runs. 1929, he's out of the majors. However, let's get an asterisk here. Went back in 1930 to Pacific Coast League and the Portland Beavers. Let's talk about that because that's an amazing thing.
Yeah, so he was, again, 39 years old, 40 years old. He actually finally went to the Yankees in 1930, spring training. The Yankees signed him, got him off waivers. But he hurt his back, and I think beyond hurting his back, his wife was ill, and I think he wanted to be out west. And I don't know if he just told them that, or he never played for the Yankees in spring training. They let him go, and he went back to Portland. That's really where he wanted to play. I think he had some other overtures, like in Kansas City, to play in the American Association. But as I mentioned, his wife was ill, and eventually came to terms. It took him a while. Ken wasn't necessarily the best businessman. You don't tell people your wife is ill and then try to negotiate a contract in your hometown. But it took him a while, and he did re-sign in Portland, and actually, 40 years old, playing center field in the minor leagues is in what was considered the top, if not the top, one of the top minor leagues in the country, and still hit 350. So he wasn't done yet, and stole a bunch of bases too that year in 1930. He still had a little life in those legs. If there was a DH back then, he would have been a great DH in the American League, but there wasn't. So he finished out in Portland.
He ended up becoming a police officer, and he owned the Owl Billard Parlor. Now, I don't know. I don't think it's still there. I think there's another building in Grand
Right, yeah, it's since changed hands and become like a cafe or something, coffee house, yeah.
But he died relatively young after heart problems. How many years did he have heart problems?
Around World War II, he started having heart problems. That's when he stopped being a policeman. He started being a policeman in the 1940s, stopped, bought the Owl Bar with Judd Purnell, was one of the guys, former ball player. And, had heart problems in the late 40s. And it really was unexpected when he died. His son said it wasn't like anything was expected, like he wasn't ill. Just he had a heart attack, and that was that.
Okay. Now let me ask you this question. Did I forget anything, or do you want to mention something that maybe I missed that you would want to tell the listeners about the book? And I don't know, make a plug for it. What can I tell you?
I appreciate it. Yeah, I mean, hopefully, if you like baseball history and want to learn more about a guy who I think should be more well known, I would sure appreciate anyone obviously giving it a read. I think there's I did a ton of research. I don't think I left too many stones unturned. Really from his minor league days up to the end when he played in the minors and had these reunions, as you mentioned in the beginning of the call. Here, he was very well regarded in St. Louis and made a number of their all quote unquote all St. Louis teams, and then I have a whole chapter devoted to kind of his Hall of Fame credentials and talking about how I think he's been unfairly labeled as a guy who was a home run hitter just because he played in St. Louis in that ballpark, when really he was a home run hitter his entire career, had power in the minors, and I compare it to players in modern day. There are guys who play in Fenway Park or Yankee Stadium who tailor their swings to those ballparks, and so I think he's a little unfairly maligned in that way, and I delve into that a lot at the very end of the book, and whether make his Hall of Fame case for and against. I try to keep even-handed on both ways. So I appreciate you having me on. Hopefully people have enjoyed it, and we'll pick it up at some point and learn more about a guy who hopefully will no longer be forgotten.
And Sam, I'm going to make a final point here, because in your book you mentioned, hey, look, if the Hall of Fame was created 10 or 20 years later, Williams would be in. But I think this is a big overshadow of Williams. So he ends his career in 29. What happens in 30? It's the biggest hitting spree ever in Major League Baseball history. You got Jim Fox, you got Mel Ott, you still got Ruth, you got Al Simmons. I think that overshadowed Williams. And I think that if it really wasn't that spurt of what's his name, Hack Wilson, he had 180 some, and all these players are now just crushing the ball, I think Williams would have been voted in. That's my opinion.
Yeah, and the Hall of Fame really was slow to bring guys in. If you look at their history, it took a long time. It wasn't until the 50s. I mean, Joe DiMaggio didn't get it in the first ballot, right? So, and they were very picky, obviously. So in the 50s, he got a vote here and a vote here, a vote there. But by then, he hadn't played in 30 years. And as you mentioned, the offense had picked up, and they didn't have many guys in. So you're not going to put Ken Williams in over Joe DiMaggio, or those kind of players. So I think timing, his baseball timing was not the best when he came. If he was born 10 years later, it would be interesting to see what would happen to him. But that's baseball.
Yeah. We could find it on Amazon. We could find it at McFarland. Where else can we find it?
Oh, yeah, Barnes & Noble, I think. Just go online, do your searches. It's out there. I appreciate you can buy it from wherever makes the most sense to you. Save some money, whatever you want to do. But I appreciate it, and I hope you enjoy it. I'm on Twitter. You can find me Dave_Heller. If you have any comments or questions, I'm happy to always answer.
Hey, it was great having you on the show. Hold the line. This is how I end the show. Folks, I hope you learned a lot about Ken Williams. I know I did. One of the most overlooked players in the 1920s. Again, when you're in Root's shadow and when you're playing for the St. Louis Browns, chances are you will be overlooked. We'll get Dave back onto the show to talk about the 44 Browns, because that's something I like to do. But as always, I am your host, Ian Kahanowitz. Thank you all for tuning in. And in the immortal words of Edwin R. Murrow, good night, folks. Good luck. We'll see you next time.